Hello, I'm Hazem Seeker. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. Despite warmer relations with North Korea, US President Donald Trump continues to threaten international trade ties. Brexit countdown, why businesses are warning that parts of UK manufacturing risk becoming extinct. Plus, the growth of the video game industry, it's outpacing music and cinema in the money race. So, US President Donald Trump's relationship with North Korea's Kim Jong-un seems to be all smiles, but his trade ties with Western allies and China are unraveling. The US slapped a 25% tariff on imports of steel and a 10% tariff on aluminium on the European Union, Canada, and Mexico earlier this month. Not surprisingly, they plan to respond with their own tariffs on US goods. And it was reported on Friday that Trump has approved tariffs on $50 billion worth of Chinese imports. The decision could spark a trade war between the world's two biggest economies. Florence Louis has that.
Ultimately, the US wants to reduce its trade deficit with China, and it wants to give American companies greater access to the Chinese market. The two countries have been holding talks to avoid a possible trade war. And after 3 rounds of talks, the Chinese have agreed to increase their purchases of farm and energy products from US by as much as $70 billion. But if these tariffs go ahead, that deal will be void, and China has threatened further action.
If the United States takes unilateral protectionist measures harming China's interests, we will quickly react and take necessary steps to resolutely protect our fair, legitimate rights.
If the tariffs are imposed, they could complicate the relationship between China and the US at a time when the US needs China's help in enforcing UN sanctions on North Korea. The Trump administration believes it was these tougher sanctions that played a part in forcing North Korea to the negotiation table. But some analysts also say because the talks between North Korea and the US were a success, then Trump now has a little bit more leeway to be tougher on China with regards to trade, because China is not going to want to derail the process for denuclearization on the Korean peninsula, because that is consistent with China's own security interests.
Well, joining us now from London to talk more about this is Andrew Kenningham, Chief Global Economist at Capital Economics. Thanks very much for being with us. So, first off, what are the implications then of what is looking right now like a major trade rift between the US and Canada?
Well, the implications for Canada itself are potentially fairly large. I mean, Canada exports a lot of steel to the United States, and it's one of the key members of NAFTA. And if the United States walks away from NAFTA, as well as imposing the steel tariffs, we could see slightly weaker growth in Canada, perhaps by about 0.5% of GDP over the next couple of years. So it's a negative, not perhaps a huge one, but certainly a negative.
Well, what are the chances then that the US under Trump could actually walk away from NAFTA? I mean, there are questions in the US about whether he actually has the authority to do that by himself. But putting that aside, given the current state of relations, is that a real possibility?
Well, it did look rather unlikely a few weeks ago because the two sides seemed to be reaching an agreement on the most controversial issue, which is about cars and the local content in the car exports. So we thought an agreement might just be reached, but it's now looking less likely again. And we have elections coming up in Mexico, which could result in a more populist president there who would be less likely to reach an agreement with the US. So I think it is a possibility. I mean, it's very hard, obviously, to read President Trump's mind, but it's a possibility, but not perhaps the most likely scenario. I think more likely we see negotiations drag on.
And then along with all of this, we see China stepping into the breach more, it seems, when it comes to the issue of free trade. With their whole One Belt initiative. What do you make of that? Because that's something that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago.
Well, I think the China-US situation is potentially more damaging for the world economy, and we could well see Trump or the US administration impose significant tariffs on China in the next few days. Even there are suggestions that could affect maybe up to $150 billion worth of Chinese exports to the United States, and certainly that would have a negative impact both on the Chinese economy and also on business confidence more generally. But I think provided that the measures don't go much wider than what has been threatened so far, these will remain issues for particular industries and for particular countries rather than something that threatens the overall situation of the global economy, which actually is still looking quite good.
And it would seem as well that the much heralded Trump-Kim summit in Singapore is already reaping benefits for China. What's your view on that?
Well, I think it's very early to jump to that conclusion. The markets barely reacted to the summit, which was interesting. But then, of course, they barely reacted a year ago when Trump was threatening North Korea with fire and fury. So I think the markets are right. They think that we need to wait and see, and that there's a long way to go before we can be confident that the North Korean regime and Kim himself is willing to denuclearize. It will be a very difficult thing for both sides to do.
Does he have it right on tariffs?
No, I agree with the vast majority of economists that protectionism is very unlikely to be helpful. The only way it could work out well, I think, is if other countries were to open up and there would be some kind of a trade deal. For example, China being more willing to let investment into its banking sector and perhaps reduce tariffs on car imports. So that's the only potential positive outcome, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen. And the way that the Trump administration is going about things is very odd, because they're putting the tariffs on a lot of their key allies as well as on their enemies in terms of the trade war, and that's not going to help. So it would be better if they were to work with Europe to put some pressure on China, for example, rather than creating a sort of atmosphere where it's everybody against the United States.
Good to speak with you. Andrew Kenningham, thanks for being with us.
You're welcome.
All right, still to come on Counting the Cost. It's being dubbed the NAFTA World Cup. Despite their frosty relations, Canada, Mexico, and the USA will jointly host the event 8 years from now. But first, some of the biggest names in media are teaming up to survive. Time Warner owns news channel CNN and HBO, the maker of Game of Thrones, and it's being taken over by US telecoms giant AT&T in an $85 billion deal. The two companies are joining forces to compete against tech rivals Netflix and Amazon. US cable giant Comcast, owner of NBC Universal, is looking to get bigger too with a merger of its own. Merger mania could mean more competition and better value for consumers. John Hendren has more.
Comcast is offering $65 billion for the movie and television assets of 21st Century Fox. That outbids Disney, which had previously offered $52 billion. At stake are the global television channels, such as National Geographic, satellite television networks, Sky in Europe, Star in India, and the Hulu streaming service, which is number 3 after Amazon and Netflix. Why is this all happening now? Because a day earlier, on Tuesday, a U.S. judge ruled that AT&T could go ahead with its $85 billion bid for Time Warner. The Trump administration had objected on antitrust grounds, saying it was too much media in one set of hands. But a judge overruled that, saying it could go ahead. That seems to have begun to set off merger mania. Media companies want to go vertical. They want to marry content with distribution. That's a model created by Amazon and Netflix, which started out doing distribution and then created their own content. That's a model everybody is now competing with.
Our anti-corruption watchdog Transparency International says Dubai must clean up its real estate sector after an investigation into dirty money. The Washington-based Center for Advanced Defense Studies found money laundering by people it calls war profiteers and terror financiers living under U.S. sanctions. It identified around $100 million in what it says are suspicious purchases based on leaked data from the Emirati city. The government-run Dubai media office hasn't commented on the report. With an expected revenue of nearly $140 billion this year, the world of video games is fast becoming one of the most popular forms of entertainment. Rob Reynolds has more.
The E3 Expo is always a kaleidoscope of color, clamor, and crowds eager to experience the newest in cutting-edge electronic entertainment. This year, everyone is talking about Fortnite, the massively popular multiplayer battle royale game.
I'm just madly in love with it. Like all the dances and moves, and battle royale is my favorite mode.
If you're a parent, you've probably seen your kids playing Fortnite non-stop. If you are a millennial, you're probably playing it right now.
I'd say I spend more time than I should, yeah. I've probably spent a few hundred hours in the time I've played. It's hard to keep track.
Game industry professionals say Fortnite could be, if you'll excuse the pun, a game changer.
Right now it's hot, like everyone wants to get in on the battle royale genre, you know, the last player standing genre. I think like the coolest thing about Fortnite is the fact that it's cross-platform play, you know, so when you're playing on mobile, you could be going up against someone who's on PC or console.
This year's E3 features plenty of the game industry's bread and butter, bullets, bombs, and blood. This is Ubisoft's take on Homer's epic The Odyssey, a new addition to its Assassin's Creed franchise. Forget the poetry, bring on the gore.
It's kind of going back to the very gun-heavy, really, like I saw some stuff that's just ultra-violent.
But there are other games that reflect the times we live in.
There's an amazing game on mobile called Bury Me, My Love, which is it's the story of a Syrian refugee. You play the Syrian refugee texting his wife as she travels across Europe.
Video games don't get the artistic respect that recorded music and films do. The gaming industry has already long surpassed the recorded music and the cinema industry in terms of revenue as a source of entertainment. And huge new markets for electronic entertainment are opening up in China and the developing world.
The head of Britain's top business lobby group says Brexit could wipe out the country's car industry. It is now almost 2 years since the UK voted to leave the European Union, and many people remain unclear about the country's direction. Lawrence Lee visited Sunderland in northern England to meet some of them.
Sunderland is a place which demonstrates only too clearly all the contradictions of Brexit and the mess the UK is currently in. This region is one of the poorest parts of Northern Europe. Unhappy it voted to leave the European Union to try something else. Take Sid. He's run this business for nearly half a century, selling parts of the region's manufacturing industry. Sid is what's known as a hard Brexiter. He shrugs off worries that leaving the European Union might endanger his business. He wants the UK out completely and is fed up that the government he supports can't get the job done.
I want people to stand up. I want our politicians to stand up for England, stand up for their own people, instead of getting pushed around. And they're just not doing it. They're not doing it.
Do you think they're frightened? What is it, do you think?
I honestly don't know. Or they say all the right things, and then when it comes to doing it, carrying out, they're falling down. They don't do it.
Just up the road, Nissan employs 7,000 people, with tens of thousands more in the supply chain. If the UK abandons European trade agreements, all those jobs could be at risk. Steve is the union representative of the workers. Its position is that if Brexit happens, it must be a soft one, allowing the UK to trade freely with Europe. Otherwise, the union fears disaster looms.
It would be absolute devastation, and I also think, to conclude on that, it would take decades to recover also.
So is there anything to replace those jobs if they were to go?
At this moment in time, no, there isn't.
The government talks all the time about Brexit enabling a global Britain, free to trade where it likes. This company does that already. It makes tanks for water treatment plants and has plans to expand. For the company boss, Brexit is a source of enormous instability, and he wishes it would just go away.
I'm a strong supporter of the UK in general. However, I think the unknown is the thing that we're frightened of most, and I don't think the government's doing the best it could to give us the information and communication on the next steps and what's likely to happen on an exit from the EU.
In microcosm, this region tells the story of how Brexiters won the referendum but seem not to know what to do with their victory to mend this divided country. As things stand, there is no constituency in this country which is happy with the way Brexit is being conducted, not the hardliners who want to leave the European Union completely, not the Remainers who want to stay in, and not those people in the middle happy to accept some sort of in-out fudge. But the one thing they would all agree on is that there seems to be an almost total lack of political leadership, a sense of where on earth the country is going next.
It's worth recalling that the point of Brexit was to allow the UK greater control of its destiny. Yet as of now, nobody has any idea if Brexit will happen, whether it might improve all the things places like Sunderland lost, or whether it will make a bad situation even worse.
Well, joining us now from Glasgow is Gregor Irwin, Chief Economist at the Global Council. Thanks very much for being with us. So it doesn't look like we're any closer at this point to knowing what Brexit is going to look like. The longer that goes on, what sort of damage is it doing to the UK economy?
Well, I mean, there's one very simple reason why we're not any closer to understanding what Brexit is going to look like, which is that the British government still hasn't made up its mind, and there's no immediate sign of that being solved. There are big divisions within the government. The longer that goes on, the more likely we're to see firms, investors begin to implement their contingency plans. They'll be planning on the basis of worst case scenario, which might even be that there's no deal at all by the time the UK leaves the EU. And certainly they'll be planning on the basis that there will be some disruption at the end of a transition period. So yes, we are almost certainly beginning to enter a period where investors and businesses are adjusting to the delays in the negotiation.
How does this complicate businesses in the decisions that they have to make the longer this uncertainty goes on?
Well, if you are a manufacturing business that's operating in the UK but relies on supply chains that extend into the rest of the EU or exports into the EU market, then certainly you will want to be sure that after Brexit, customs arrangements will allow you to keep operating on a smooth, straightforward basis. If you're unsure about that, then you need to begin to plan and make changes to the way in which you operate to take account of the worst possible scenario, which might be that there are new customs controls and disruptions at the border. And that's what many businesses are focused on just now.
And talk to us about the mood in Scotland, where you are. A lot of frustration being felt by the government in London about the way they're handling things, concerns particularly about the fisheries industry there.
Yes, fishing is a very sensitive political issue. It always has been since the UK joined the EU. It's one of those areas where Britain as a whole, and especially Scotland, gives more than it takes in the relationship with the EU. So there is strong support within much of the fishing industry for leaving the EU. But look, the EU in this negotiation has a lot of leverage, and it is very unlikely that the fishing industry is going to get what it wants from this negotiation. The EU is going to insist that if the UK has access to EU markets, then the EU will have access to fishing rights around the whole of the UK.
All of this lack of clarity, what effect is this having?
Well, you know, there are two different issues. One is the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And the EU is insisting that there have to be guarantees in the withdrawal agreements that there will be no hard border. The UK wants to do that in a way which doesn't create divisions between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. That may well end up tying the UK into the EU's customs union for a period of time. In Scotland, there's a separate set of issues, which is around devolved powers to the Scottish Parliament. The British government wants to take control over some of those powers so that when responsibilities are returned from Brussels, they can set UK-wide policy frameworks. But the Scottish Parliament objects to the UK government doing that unilaterally. And at the moment, we have a standoff which has been resolved for the time being by the UK government really pushing through the changes that it wants to happen. So we have a constitutional crisis of sorts in Scotland.
Good to speak with you, Gregor Irwin. Thanks very much for your time.
You're very welcome.
All right, artificial intelligence is no longer the stuff of science fiction. It is used now in smartphones, cars, and even children's toys. Exactly how businesses are harnessing its power has been on display at the world's largest AI summit in London. Sonia Gallego was there.
When we think of the world of artificial intelligence, it's a world that ranges from the mind-blowing to the mundane. But essentially, it is part of our everyday lives, from the phones that we use to the vehicles that we drive. And in London at this AI summit, it is examining the practicalities that go towards making our world a little easier to function. So how is AI being used here on this motorbike?
Well, there are a couple of sensors in the bike that will show up immediately. See? You can see the temperature in the engine. You can see the gas level, you can see the pressure. Here you have the battery. If you're like me and you don't know where the engine is, this can help you see the engine.
Great.
And do some small maintenance work, like changing the battery, for example. Remove the left side after unscrewing.
And it literally shows you exactly how to do it.
It shows you how to get to the battery that we need to remove the seat. The seat is gone.
Terrific.
Yeah. It's really useful, and imagine a mechanical shop with people having these on glasses. It will really make their life easier.
And of course, let's not forget the very human need for companionship. Making a comeback, the pet robot, perhaps the perfect addition to the busy techies lifestyle.
And finally, you might have noticed the 2018 FIFA World Cup kicked off this week, placing host Russia in the global spotlight over the next month. Organisers are predicting the windfall from the tournament could be as high as $30 billion. But ratings agency Moody's says Russia won't score that big. They say the economic impact from hosting the event is likely to be limited and short-lived. Well, the cost of hosting the World Cup 8 years from now will be shared by 3 countries. Canada, the USA, and Mexico will be looking to put their current trade spats behind them by 2026. Lee Wellings reports from Moscow.
Canada, Mexico and USA have been selected by the FIFA Congress to host the 2026 FIFA World Cup.
The World Cup will return to the United States of America for the first time in 32 years. Its bid involving Mexico and Canada, the United bid, was the heavyweight candidate. It was an emphatic and unsurprising triumph, with 134 votes to 65 for the other contender, Morocco. The US were the big players in this all along. They will host 60 games, Mexico 10 and Canada 10.
Thank you for entrusting us with this privilege, the privilege of hosting the FIFA World Cup in 2026. Let us also salute our friends from Morocco. At the end of the day, we are all united in football. That's the spirit of the World Cup.
Snubbed in their 2022 bid, losing out to Qatar, the Stars and Stripes have loomed large over FIFA. It was the American investigators, Attorney General and the FBI who brought down Sepp Blatter's FIFA 3 years ago. New FIFA, same issues. The politics of keeping America sweet and, crucially, making money. The United bid promised billions of dollars more. This host decision was a transparent vote for the first time, which caused its own problems. 203 national associations with their decision under political scrutiny. President Trump had tweeted in April that it would be a shame if countries that we always support were to lobby against the US bid.
I'm not worried about anything. At the least, I'm worried about the President of the United States or Mexico or Canada, Prime Minister or anyone
I don't think
else.
you'll try and take over.
I think the question was answered.
I don't think anyone tries to take over FIFA. FIFA belongs to football and to the members of FIFA.
Now the task for Trump and his administration will be to work closely with Mexico and Canada, neighbours with whom relations have been distinctly strained in recent months over immigration and trade.
And that is our show for this week. Remember, you can get in touch with us by tweeting me at Hazem Seeker and use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. And there's more for you online, as always, aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Hazem Seeker from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.